You know, when they let, I think the real number is 15, 16 million people into our country, when they do that, we got a lot of work to do. They're poisoning the blood of our country. That's what they've done. They poison mental institutions and prisons all over the world, not just in South America, not just the 3 or 4 countries that we think about, but all over the world. They're coming into our country from Africa, from Asia, all over the world. They're pouring into our country. Nobody's even looking at them. They just come in.
Professor Thomas Webber, thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks for having me.
Thomas, over the weekend, Donald Trump told a rally that immigrants in the US are poisoning the blood of our country, which caused another comparison between him and Adolf Hitler. Why is it that quote that has caused the condemnation?
Because he was really using two of Hitler's favorite terms, blood and poisoning, and rather the idea that you can poison an entire nation, that you can poison the lifeblood of a nation. And Donald Trump was using language that Hitler had also used in Mein Kampf and in many of his speeches.
We pledge to you that we will root out the communists, Marxists, fascists, and the radical left thugs that live like vermin within the confines of our country, that lie and steal and cheat on elections and will do anything possible. They'll do anything, whether legally or illegally, to destroy America and to destroy the American dream.
President Joe Biden then accused Donald Trump of echoing Hitler with the use of the word vermin. Trump referred to those who lean politically left as vermin, while Hitler was known to use that exact same word when he was referencing his enemies. What did you make of this? Do you think it's a bit of a stretch to compare the two just by the use of that one word?
When it comes to this one word, yes, absolutely, because unfortunately, that is the dehumanization and the reference to political opponents as vermin is quite common, unfortunately, in politics, both past and present. So I think he was on stronger ground when referring to Mein Kampf in terms of the blood poisoning reference, but with the vermin, I'm less convinced.
Through all your research, because you've done so much research, Thomas, on both Hitler and Trump, do you think that Donald Trump is telling the truth when he says he hasn't read Mein Kampf?
No, not really. I mean, he might be telling the truth in a kind of very narrow sense, in that he did not read Mein Kampf from cover to cover, but two people close to him have confirmed that he used to have this kind of compendium or anthology of Hitler's speeches and sections of Mein Kampf next to his bedside, and it's absolutely clear that he had that and that he would have also browsed through it. But we have got to bear in mind that Donald Trump sees himself as kind of the ultimate truth teller. This means that that little lies in the service of telling what he sees as the ultimate truth is acceptable. So in that sense, we should not take those kind of claims that he wouldn't have read Mein Kampf literal, but would see it as a kind of little lie in the service of telling the greater truth.
Well, I want to go back to what you were saying before, because just for the context of the audience, in a Vanity Fair interview from 1990, Trump's first wife, Ivana Trump, was alleged to have told her lawyer that Donald Trump keeps a copy of Hitler's speech book, My New Order, which you were speaking about, in his cabinet by the bed, which he occasionally read. And then the friend of which who supposedly gave it to Trump did back that up, but Trump denied ever reading it. What do you make of this? Do you think that in those early years, before he even considered a presidential future, that he was doing his research into someone that he could potentially, mirror any leadership style of?
That seems perfectly plausible, and that would be well in line with other future political leaders. Of course, we have got to be careful here. I mean, we have got to bear in mind that engaging with Mein Kampf has an attraction for lots of people, and this does not necessarily mean they all want to become little Hitlers. So in many ways, it's maybe a good thing that people engage with Hitler's writings, but the danger here is, of course, whether or not he may have read Mein Kampf as kind of a manual for political leadership. And there I'm concerned that indeed he did engage with Mein Kampf in that way, in line with other authoritarian leaders from around the world.
Professor, do you think there's a comparison at all between Donald Trump and Hitler when it comes to their stance on religion?
Probably not so much on religion. I mean, they're kind of critical about religion. I mean, both of them are critical of religion, but in kind of different ways. For Adolf Hitler, he was born a Catholic and he was raised a Catholic, but he really then distanced himself from his Catholicism and from traditional Christianity while still officially paying lip service to that because he wanted to kind of use that. But he then really kind of believed in having chosen by kind of destiny, and then he was trying to turn National Socialism into kind of an alternative religion, and he was really kind of using religious language in order to inspire his followers to follow him and to go to war and commit genocide. And that's something we don't really see with Donald Trump, but we do see more with someone like Putin.
When a leader acts like a dictator, on the note of Putin, as you brought up, when a leader acts like a dictator, the most common thing we do is compare them to Hitler as, you know, the highest form of criticism when it comes to that kind of leadership. But has Donald Trump rightfully earned this comparison more so than any other leader that we've seen in our modern time?
I think that in a way there are two questions here. I mean, one is generally, does it actually make sense always to invoke Hitler? On one level, working on Hitler, that's absolutely fine with me, but from a kind of political or analytical point of view, that is highly problematic because there are so many other historical and political figures of the past that might provide better lens to understand the present. I mean, just take Donald Trump. I mean, I think if you look at authoritarian leaders from Europe like Berlusconi, you will actually learn far more about Donald Trump. But having said that, as far as Hitler is concerned, is the at least in terms of political language, in terms of rhetoric, in terms of campaigning, we do see clear similarities between Donald Trump and Adolf Hitler. But when it comes to political goals, I'm less convinced. I don't think that fascism is the best lens through which to look in order to understand Donald Trump, and it might actually be a distraction. It might not help us to really understand what Donald Trump is really about or why people are supporting Donald Trump. And it's also important to bear in mind that there are other political leaders for whom that comparison might work even better. I mean, I already mentioned Donald Trump. And another case in point is the leader of Turkey, Erdogan, who also walked around with a copy of Mein Kampf as a student as he grew up, and who, when he tried to turn Turkey into a presidential system, he specifically mentioned the case of Nazi Germany, of Hitler's Germany, as an example of how you can successfully turn a state into a presidential system. So there are unfortunately many leaders who take inspiration from Hitler for political leadership, even if their political goals might be very different.
Do you think that Trump knows what he's doing when he's using this language that kind of ignites this comparison between him and Hitler? It's not exactly the best thing for him to be doing in a presidential campaign.
Broadly, of course, he knows full well what he is doing in order to ignite his followers. I'm not sure whether when he first used the language of poisoning blood over the weekend, whether he was aware where this was coming from. In fact, it's perfectly plausible that he picked that up from something else that he was consuming. And we do know that he's increasingly engaging with radical right-wing news outlets and so on. So that's perfectly possible. But it's also important to note that once he realized that, or once it was pointed out to him, he still doubled down and went along with that. Of course, he then kind of claims that he never knew that this was Hitler, but we will never hear an apology from Donald Trump, and he just doubled down. and therefore, whether or not he was initially aware of what he was doing, he has continued to ignite the political climate in America.
Yeah, well, we certainly wouldn't receive an apology from him. But on that note, Trump still says things like Putin is very smart, or that he has a good relationship with Kim Jong-un, or that Xi is a brilliant man. Now, what does that say about him to be publicly praising the dictators, the enemies of the United States?
I think it means that he ultimately believes in strong leadership. He ultimately doesn't really believe in democracy as a form of government. I mean, if you asked him directly, he would deny that. He might even mean it, but I don't think that's probably because he doesn't quite understand how democracy works. I mean, and we have seen this actually time and time again, also from insiders during his first presidency, that he was absolutely surprised that there are checks and balances in the US constitutions, that he was surprised that he couldn't just do whatever he wanted. He thought he had unlimited authority as president. And he ultimately thinks that that is how the world operates and should operate. He ultimately thinks that that is the only way to tame human nature, and that is in this kind of intricate relationships between people in their own countries, but also internationally, how the international system can be tamed. And so he ultimately thinks that if strong leaders from around the world treat each other with in this kind of way, both with respect but also with backed up with force, then the world will become a more peaceful world. I mean, whether or not we agree with that view of the world is an entirely different question.
But is that approach to leadership similar to Hitler?
No, not at all, because ultimately Hitler thought that you cannot ultimately tame that the international system in that way, that regular wars were really necessary to create security, in the first step, to overcome what he thought was the greatest crisis of all times, in that a major war was necessary. And even in a post-war order, Hitler thought that regular wars were necessary, while Donald Trump does not really particularly like the use of military force. I mean, he likes the display of the military, but he is very reluctant, actually more reluctant than most modern presidents, to actually use and to deploy the military. So in that sense, he's very different to Adolf Hitler.
Well, on that note, Thomas, last year the New Yorker reported that when Donald Trump was in office, he told his then chief of staff, who was a retired Marine, that the US generals should be more like the German generals in World War II. How credible do you think that claim is?
I think it's absolutely credible. I mean, most of those kinds of claims have ultimately been confirmed, even if Donald Trump then later on claimed that he never said that. This goes back to what I said earlier about telling little lies in the name of being the ultimate truth teller. But of course, we also need to look at what did Donald Trump mean when he was praising Hitler's generals. This does not, I don't think it meant that he was praising going for an all-out war. I think this was more this idea, look, Hitler had all these supposedly brilliant generals who would not be outsmarted by anyone else, while he thinks that US generals have repeatedly been outsmarted. So it's more about, again, a certain style of leadership rather than the deployment of military force. Of course, he totally misunderstood how German generals operated during the Second World War, but that's a different issue.
Well, to compare world events, Thomas, can we compare the 1923 beer hall putsch with Hitler and the 2000 Nazis to the January 6th Capitol riots at all? Is that a comparable, event between two big leaders?
Well, yes and no. I mean, obviously, any kind of insurrection event of the past and the present are useful to compare, but not to necessarily to equate. And in these particular two instances, we have two credible attempts to bring a democracy down. But in the first case, in Hitler's case, we have a kind of premeditated attempt that had been going on for months and months, with that collusion between different political factions. While with the January 6th insurrection, there was something far more spontaneous, and something where Donald Trump, being really frustrated that Mike Pence did not do what he was hoping he would do, was jumping on the bandwagon. But in both cases, we have insurrections aimed at bringing down democracy.
How do we compare the MAGA voters to the Nazi voters? How do we compare these two large followings that both Trump and Hitler have had? Is there anything concerning about the future of Trump's followers?
Yes, there is, but maybe not the way people normally describe things. So there's of course very much this kind of narrative that there is both the global fascism rising and as well as American fascism, and that all of Donald Trump's supporters are, or most of them, are radical right-wing racists and so on. And in that sense, that they're comparable to Hitler's voters. I don't think it actually works along those lines. I mean, sure, that kind of support also exists, but it's a relatively small part of the electorate. I think where the comparison works better is that also at the time, a lot of people supported Hitler for reasons other than what Hitler's ultimate goals were. So they kind of underestimated Hitler, or kind of everyone had their own Hitler. Everyone thought, kind of moderates thought, well, Hitler is just using all this radical language, but if we support him, we actually get moderate politics. While the radical thought that Hitler really meant what he thought. So where I'm going where I'm going here with my argument is that a lot of people supported Hitler for all kinds of reasons, and only realized when it was too late what they were really doing. And we see something slightly similar here, because a lot of people in America, a lot of supporters of Donald Trump, basically say, well, look, yeah, Donald Trump's rhetoric is a bit crazy, but you really have got to kind of make a distinction here between Donald Trump, the personality, and Donald Trump, the administration. They say, well, look, if we look at the first 4 years in government, you see a person who is maybe constantly lying and who's saying a lot of despicable things, but who ultimately was delivering. And the expectation of that kind of supporter is that something similar will happen if Donald Trump is being reelected. And they underestimate the extent to which Donald Trump would be able to use the power of the presidency to really change things quite radically. And I think in that sense, there are comparisons between Hitler's voters and Trump's voters.
Professor Thomas Weber, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you for having me.